Unaware he owned the trillionaire dollar company her lover worked for, she divorced her husband by text message and emptied their $350 joint account to fund her lover's business, unaware he's ahead of her. What he did shocked her and left her lover shattered and bankrupt. Victoria Hammond had spent 12 years building an empire alongside a man whose true wealth she never comprehended. But her obsession with Derek Sullivan, a charismatic mid-level executive at what she believed was just another tech corporation, had blinded her to the foundation beneath her own luxurious life. The text message she sent on that rainy October morning contained just 43 words that dissolved a marriage. But the wire transfers she authorized in the following 72 hours moved $350 million from accounts she assumed were jointly earned into her lover's struggling startup. Victoria believed she was funding innovation and securing her future with a passionate man who understood her ambitions, but she had no idea that every presentation Derek had ever delivered, every strategy he'd ever pitched, and every corporate ladder he'd ever climbed existed within a structure owned entirely by the quiet, unassuming man she'd just discarded. The company wasn't just successful, it was a trillionaire dollar empire that operated through subsidiary networks so complex that even its own employees rarely understood the ownership chain. But the man at the very top had always kept his position private, preferring operational anonymity to public recognition. How could a woman married to ultimate power mistake it for ordinary success? What happens when the money you steal to build your lover's dream becomes the weapon that destroys everything he's worked for? Could the husband she abandoned with cruel efficiency have been watching every move, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal that he wasn't a victim, but a chess master who'd anticipated every play? Victoria Hammond stood in the marble-floored foyer of her Beacon Hill townhouse, but her mind was already in the downtown penthouse, where Derek Sullivan waited. The early morning light filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating furniture that cost more than most people's homes, but she'd grown numb to luxury somewhere around year 7 of her marriage. Her phone felt heavy in her perfectly manicured hands, but the weight came from what she was about to do rather than the device itself. She typed the message with steady fingers, but her heart raced with something between exhilaration and guilt. James, this marriage has been empty for years. I want a divorce. My lawyer will contact you. Don't try to reach me. 43 words to end 12 years, but Victoria had convinced herself that brevity was mercy. She pressed send before she could reconsider, but the immediate delivery notification brought relief rather than regret. James Hammond, the man she was, leaving, sat in his modest downtown office at that exact moment, but his space bore none of the ostentation one might expect from someone of his actual position. The office was deliberately simple: a wooden desk that had belonged to his father, 2 comfortable chairs for visitors, and a single photograph of his wedding day that he now looked at with something between sadness and calculation. His phone buzzed with Victoria's text, but he'd been expecting it for 3 months, ever since his private security team had first reported her affair with Derek Sullivan. He read the message twice, but his expression revealed nothing to the empty room. James had built his life on patience and observation, but his wife had never noticed these qualities because she'd been too busy mistaking his quietness for passivity. She thought he ran a successful consulting firm, but the reality was so much larger that explaining it would have sounded like delusion. He'd let her believe the simplified version because business complexity bored her, but also because some part of him had wanted to be loved for himself rather than his wealth. The irony wasn't lost on him, but James didn't indulge in self-pity. Victoria had married him when he was already wealthy by any reasonable standard, but the empire he'd built in the following years had grown beyond even his own early projections. Hammond Industries existed as a parent corporation that owned 17 subsidiary networks, but these networks controlled everything from technology infrastructure to pharmaceutical development to renewable energy systems. The company's value had crossed into trillionaire territory 3 years ago, but fewer than 50 people on Earth knew the full scope of its operations. Derek Sullivan worked for Meridian Tech Solutions, but he had no idea that Meridian was a third-tier subsidiary of Hammond Industries. His employment records, his salary, his performance reviews, all of it ultimately flowed through systems that James controlled, but the corporate structure was deliberately opaque. James had designed it that way specifically to prevent the kind of cult of personality that destroyed so many large organizations, but the anonymity had also prevented his own wife from understanding whom she'd actually married. Victoria hadn't bothered learning about James's work, but her lack of curiosity had started early. During their courtship, she'd been attracted to his stability and resources, but she'd never asked deep questions about how those resources were generated. James had initially appreciated her disinterest in business because it meant she wanted him for himself, but over time he'd realized she simply didn't want to know him at all. She wanted the lifestyle his money provided, but not the complexity of the man who created it. The affair with Derek had begun 6 months ago at a charity gala, but Victoria's dissatisfaction had roots that went back years. She'd met Derek at a fundraiser where he'd given an impassioned presentation about Meridian Tech's new initiative in sustainable computing, an initiative that James had personally approved and funded with $40 million. Derek's charisma had captivated Victoria immediately, but she didn't know that his entire career existed because of her husband's strategic vision. Derek Sullivan was talented but not exceptional, ambitious but not particularly insightful, but he possessed the kind of surface charm that some people mistake for depth. He'd risen to senior vice president at Meridian through a combination of genuine competence and excellent presentation skills, but his understanding of the company's true position in the market was limited. He knew Meridian was successful, but he thought it operated independently when in reality, every major decision flowed through Hammond Industries' oversight committees. Victoria had fallen for Derek's vision of the future, but more than that, she'd fallen for how he made her feel central to something important. Derek talked about disrupting industries and changing the world, but what he was really describing was a mid-level executive's fantasy of entrepreneurship. He'd told Victoria about his dream of starting his own company, but he lacked the capital to move beyond dreaming. That's where Victoria had seen her opportunity, not just to help Derek, but to finally become the primary force in someone's success rather than the accessory to her husband's quiet empire. The plan had formed gradually, but Victoria had convinced herself it was inspired. She and James had a joint account that contained $350 million, but this represented only a fraction of James's actual wealth. Victoria understood that her husband was wealthy, but she'd somehow concluded that this particular account was theirs, in a way that justified her taking it. The money had accumulated from various investments and business profits over the years, but Victoria had contributed nothing to its growth. Still, her name was on the account, but her right to access it was about to become the most expensive assumption of her life. She began the transfers the day after sending the divorce text, but she didn't move all the money at once. Victoria was smarter than that, but not as smart as she believed. Over 72 hours, she executed a series of wire transfers that moved the $350 million into a business account she'd established for Derek's startup, which he'd optimistically named Sullivan Innovations. Derek had been ecstatic when she'd told him about the funding, but his gratitude had been mixed with just enough hesitation to show some awareness of the moral complexity. "Are you sure about this?" Derek had asked when she'd first proposed using the money, but his eyes had gleamed with barely suppressed excitement. "That's a lot of capital from your marriage." "It's my money too," Victoria had insisted, but she'd said it with the conviction of someone who needed to believe her own justification. "James has plenty more. He'll barely notice it's gone. Besides, he owes me for 12 years of a loveless marriage. Derek had accepted this reasoning because it served his interests, but he wasn't cruel enough to be entirely comfortable with it. He'd pushed his discomfort aside, however, because $350 million was enough to build the company he'd always dreamed of. With that kind of capital, he could hire top talent, develop cutting-edge technology, and compete with the major players in the tech industry. He'd envisioned Sullivan Innovations becoming the next great American success story, but he had no idea that his funding source was contaminated by a connection he couldn't fathom. James had watched the transfers happen in real time, but he'd allowed them to proceed without intervention. His security team had alerted him to the first movement of funds, but he'd instructed them to monitor rather than block. Some of his advisors had questioned this decision, but James had a longer game in mind. He could have frozen the account with a single phone call, but instead, he'd let Victoria commit fully to her betrayal. She needed to believe she'd succeeded, but more importantly, Derek needed to build something significant before it was all taken away. The satisfaction James sought wasn't in immediate revenge, but in the perfect revelation of truth. For 3 months after the transfers, Victoria and Derek had worked feverishly to build Sullivan Innovations into something real. They'd leased premium office space in the financial district, but the location alone cost $60,000 monthly. Derek had hired a team of developers and designers, but talent at the level he wanted didn't come cheap. The company's burn rate was extraordinary, but Derek had assured Victoria it was necessary for rapid growth. "You have to spend money to make money," Derek had said repeatedly, but he'd said it with the confidence of someone spending someone else's fortune. "We're building the foundation for $1 billion company. These expenses are investments." Victoria had believed him because she wanted to, but also because she'd convinced herself that she understood business despite never having built anything herself. She'd spent 12 years watching James work, but she'd absorbed nothing about his methods because she'd never paid attention. She thought success was about bold vision and aggressive spending, but she didn't understand that James's empire had been built on patient strategy and calculated risk management. Sullivan Innovations' business plan focused on artificial intelligence integration for small businesses, but the concept was neither particularly innovative nor well executed. Derek had identified a real market need, but his approach was derivative of solutions already being developed by larger companies. Specifically, Meridian Tech Solutions, his former employer, had a division working on almost identical technology, but with far more resources and expertise. Derek didn't know this because that division operated under a separate subsidiary structure, but James knew everything about both projects. The irony compounded daily, but James let it build. Derek had left Meridian to start Sullivan Innovations, but his departure had been amicable because James had instructed Meridian's CEO to make it so. Derek thought he'd left on good terms due to his professionalism, but the reality was that James wanted him outside the company, where his failure could be more spectacular. James had even authorized a generous severance package, but Derek had interpreted this as confirmation of his value rather than a strategic setup. Victoria had moved in with Derek within weeks of sending the divorce text, but her new life felt thrilling in ways her marriage never had. Derek's penthouse was smaller than the home she'd shared with James, but it felt more alive. Derek talked constantly about the future, but his visions were always about what they would build together. He made Victoria feel essential, but what he really needed was her money and her belief in him. The emotional validation was intoxicating, but it was built on a foundation of mutual delusion. James had responded to the divorce request through his attorneys with surprising cooperation, but this had only confirmed Victoria's belief that he was weak. He hadn't fought for their marriage or tried to contact her directly, but instead had simply agreed to her terms. The legal process was moving forward smoothly, But Victoria didn't realize that James's compliance was strategic rather than defeated. He was giving her enough rope to complete her hanging, but he was doing it so subtly that she thought she was in control. The turning point came 6 months after the initial transfers, but it didn't arrive as a single dramatic moment. Instead, Sullivan Innovations began experiencing a series of problems that seemed unrelated but were actually carefully orchestrated. First, the company's primary software developer was recruited away by a competitor offering 3 times his salary. But the competitor was actually a 5th-tier Hammond Industries subsidiary. Then, a promising client backed out of a major contract at the last minute. But the client had received better terms from Meridian Tech Solutions. Derek had started to notice a pattern, but he couldn't quite identify what connected the problems. "It's like someone's working against us," he'd told Victoria one evening, but his frustration was mixed with paranoia that she'd dismissed as stress. "Every time we get close to a breakthrough, something blocks us." "It's just bad luck," Victoria had assured him, but she'd felt the first tremors of doubt. "Every startup faces obstacles. We just have to push through." The financial pressure had intensified as Sullivan Innovations burned through capital without generating meaningful revenue. But Derek had remained convinced that success was just around the corner. The company was down to its last $40 million, but Derek had a presentation scheduled with a major investment firm that he believed would secure their next round of funding. The presentation was his chance to prove that Sullivan Innovations deserved to exist alongside the tech industry's giants, but he had no idea that the investment firm was a front company owned by Hammond Industries. James had decided it was time to reveal himself, but he planned to do it in a way that would maximize the psychological impact. He'd spent 6 months allowing Victoria and Derek to build hope, but now he would systematically dismantle everything they'd created. The cruelty wasn't in the destruction itself, but in forcing them to understand exactly how thoroughly they'd been controlled from the beginning. The presentation day arrived with crisp autumn weather, but Derek's confidence was unshakable. He'd prepared for weeks, but his pitch was polished and compelling. Victoria had come to watch, but she'd sat in the back of the conference room radiating pride. Derek had talked about market disruption and technological innovation, but his vision sounded impressive even if it wasn't particularly original. The investment partners had listened attentively, but their body language had been neutral enough to make Derek work for their approval. At the end of the presentation, the lead partner had said something that Derek had initially taken as encouragement, but which Victoria had immediately recognized as somehow wrong. "This is impressive work, Mr. Sullivan," the partner had said, but his smile had been cold. "Though I should tell you that we're already funding a superior version of this exact technology through another portfolio company. In fact, we've been funding it for 3 years. Derek's face had fallen, but he'd tried to recover. "Which company? I wasn't aware anyone was working on this specific approach." "Meridian Tech Solutions," the partner had replied, but he'd delivered the information like a surgeon making a precise cut. "Their AI integration division has been developing this technology with substantially more resources and expertise. Your former employer, I believe." The room had seemed to tilt, but Derek had maintained his composure. "I wasn't aware of that division during my time at Meridian. That must be a recent development." "Not recent," the partner had corrected, but his tone had carried an edge. "It's been operational since before you joined the company, but I suppose information like that doesn't always reach mid-level executives, does it?" The subtle insult had landed, but Derek's confusion had been overtaking his embarrassment. "Then why did you take this meeting if you're already invested in a competitor?" The partner had smiled again, but this time with something like pity. "Because the owner of Meridian Tech Solutions and the owner of this investment firm wanted to see your presentation personally. He wanted to understand exactly what his $350 million had purchased." Victoria had stood up abruptly, but her voice had caught in her throat. The numbers were too specific to be coincidental, but the implications were too vast to be immediately comprehensible. Derek had turned to look at her, but his expression had been asking questions she couldn't yet answer. The conference room door had opened, but James Hammond had entered with the same quiet presence he'd always carried. He'd worn a simple suit that probably cost $15,000 but looked ordinary, but his demeanor had been calm to the point of unsettling. He'd looked at Victoria first, but his gaze had held no anger, only a kind of patient disappointment that was somehow worse. "Hello, Victoria," James had said, but his voice had been conversational. "I hope you've enjoyed your adventure in entrepreneurship." Derek had looked between them, but understanding had been dawning in fragments. "You're James Hammond, Victoria's husband." "Soon-to-be ex-husband," James had confirmed, but he'd turned his attention to Derek with clinical interest. "And you're Derek Sullivan, formerly Senior Vice President at Meridian Tech Solutions, a company I own, currently CEO of Sullivan Innovations, a startup funded entirely with money stolen from accounts that I alone created and filled." The word stolen had hit Victoria like a physical blow, but she'd found her voice. "That was our joint account. My name was on it. I had every right." "You had access," James had interrupted, but his tone had remained measured. "Access that I provided as a courtesy to my wife. But you contributed nothing to that account, Victoria, not a single dollar. Every penny came from my businesses whose scope you never bothered to understand." Derek had been processing the revelation, but his mind had been racing through implications. "You own Meridian, but that means... It means you've spent the last 6 months competing against my resources while I watched every move you made," James had confirmed, but he'd said it almost gently. "Did you really think it was coincidence that every advantage slipped away just as you reached for it? Every developer recruited, every client lost, every obstacle that appeared. I put them there, Derek. I wanted to see what you would build with my money. The answer, it turns out, is not very much." Victoria had felt her carefully constructed reality collapsing, but she'd tried to maintain defiance. "You let me take that money. You could have stopped me, but you didn't. That makes you complicit." "I let you hang yourself," James had agreed, but there had been no satisfaction in his admission. "You sent me a divorce text, Victoria. 43 words after 12 years. You didn't just leave me. You did it with maximum cruelty and minimum respect. So I decided to let you experience what it's like to believe you're in control while someone else actually pulls every string." The lead partner had spoken up, but his role was clearly rehearsed. "Mr. Hammond has instructed us to decline your investment request, Mr. Sullivan. Furthermore, Meridian Tech Solutions will be launching their AI integration platform in 3 months. It will be priced aggressively enough to make competition impossible for underfunded startups." Derek had sunk into a chair, but his expression had been devastated. All his confidence had evaporated, but what remained was the terrible understanding that he'd been outplayed from the first moment. "Why?" he'd asked James, but the question had carried multiple layers. "Why go through all this?" "Because you needed to understand what you'd taken," James had replied, but he'd looked at Victoria rather than Derek. "Both of you did. You thought you were funding innovation, but you were actually funding a very expensive lesson about consequences." Victoria had felt tears forming, but they'd been more from frustration than sadness. "You're destroying Derek's company out of spite. He didn't do anything except fall in love with me. Derek pursued a married woman and accepted stolen money to fund his vanity project," James had corrected, but his tone had remained almost kind. "And I'm not destroying Sullivan Innovations. You already did that by underfunding it relative to its competition. I'm simply accelerating the inevitable outcome. The company will collapse within 6 weeks. Your remaining 40 million will evaporate, and Derek will return to the job market with a failed startup on his resume and a suspicious gap in his employment history. Derek had looked up sharply, but new fear had entered his expression. What do you mean, suspicious? James had pulled out his phone, but he'd displayed a series of documents. I mean that when Sullivan Innovations files for bankruptcy, which it will, there will be questions about where the initial capital came from, questions that lead to investigations that reveal the money was taken from accounts during active divorce proceedings. Victoria might technically have had access, but a prosecutor could easily argue that she took community property with intent to deprive her spouse and funnel it to her lover. Victoria had started, but the legal implications had been crashing down on her. We didn't commit any crime. It was my account too. The law is complicated, James had acknowledged, but he'd delivered the information without sympathy. And very expensive to navigate. I imagine you'll both need excellent attorneys. Unfortunately, good legal representation is costly, and you've just spent $350 million learning that Derek isn't capable of turning capital into sustainable business. The partner had stood, but his involvement in the scene was apparently complete. Gentlemen, Ms. Hammond, I believe our business is concluded. He'd nodded to James with professional respect, but then had left the room. Derek had remained seated, but his entire body had seemed to collapse inward. The magnitude of the disaster was still unfolding, but the immediate reality was already unbearable. His dream company was revealed as a doomed project, but worse than that was the understanding that he'd never been in competition. He'd been in a demonstration. James Hammond had funded Sullivan Innovations' failure as an object lesson in hubris. Victoria had tried one more approach, but her voice had been smaller. James, please, we can work this out. I made a mistake. Multiple mistakes, James had interrupted, but without heat. You underestimated your husband. You overestimated your lover. You mistook access for ownership and spending for building. But the biggest mistake was thinking you could discard me with a text message and face no consequences. So what happens now? Derek had asked, but he'd sounded defeated. You've proven your point. You've shown us how powerless we are. What more do you want? James had considered the question, but his answer had been measured. I want you both to understand what you actually destroyed. Victoria, you didn't leave a boring consultant. You left the founder of a trillionaire-dollar empire who loved you enough to let you believe he was ordinary. Derek, you didn't seduce an unhappy wife away from a weak husband. You became complicit in theft from someone who controls more resources than you can imagine. The consequences aren't about punishment. They're about natural outcomes of your choices. But you're engineering these outcomes, Victoria had protested, but she'd been grasping for any foothold. You admitted you've been sabotaging us. I've been competing with you, James had corrected, using the same money you took from me. You wanted to fund innovation, so I showed you what actual innovation looks like when it has proper backing and expertise. Meridian's AI platform will revolutionize small business technology. Sullivan Innovations would have been a footnote even without my interference. I simply made the comparison more direct. Derek had found a fragment of his earlier confidence, but it had been hollow. So Meridian launches their platform and we fail. Fine. But we still have each other. We still have our relationship. You can't take that. James had smiled, for the first time, but it had been genuinely amused. Derek, you don't have a relationship. You have a shared disaster. Victoria chose you because you made her feel important and because you represented escape from a marriage she didn't value. But now you're not an escape. You're a trap. You're the man whose failure cost her $350 million and potentially her freedom if prosecutors decide to file charges. How long do you think love survives that kind of resentment? Victoria had looked at Derek then, but something had shifted in her expression. The doubt had been there all along, but James's words had crystallized it into something harder. Derek had noticed the change, but his own look at Victoria had been reassessing. The woman who had seemed so confident and powerful when she was funding his dreams now appeared different, not as a patron but as a source of catastrophic liability. "You're trying to poison us against each other," Victoria had said, but her voice had lacked conviction. "It won't work." "I don't need to try," James had replied, but he'd already been moving toward the door. "Reality will do that naturally. Derek will realize that you destroyed his career by association. You'll realize that you gave up security and substantial wealth for a man who couldn't execute a business plan with unlimited funding. The resentment will build slowly, but it will be thorough. Give it 6 months, you'll barely be speaking." He'd opened the door, but he'd paused for one final observation. "The divorce will be finalized in 3 weeks, Victoria. You'll receive a settlement of $5 million. Generous given that you stole 70 times that amount. I'm not pursuing criminal charges despite having grounds to do so. Consider that mercy rather than weakness. As for you, Derek, Meridian would have promoted you within a year if you'd stayed. You were genuinely competent at what you did. But you reached for something bigger without understanding the landscape. That's not a crime, but it is expensive." James had left them sitting in the conference room, but the silence after his departure had been devastating. Victoria and Derek had looked at each other, but neither had found words adequate to the situation. The love they'd felt just an hour earlier had been complicated by layers of recrimination and regret that neither was ready to voice. But the words would come, just as James had predicted, but the damage was already irreversible. The aftermath Sullivan Innovations collapsed in 5 weeks, rather than James's predicted 6, but the speed only intensified Derek's humiliation. The bankruptcy proceedings revealed the funding source, but as James had warned, this triggered exactly the kind of scrutiny that made both Derek and Victoria radioactive in business circles. No charges were ultimately filed, but the investigation itself was damaging enough. Victoria's name appeared in trade publications alongside words like alleged misappropriation and questionable transfer, but her social standing evaporated. Derek had tried to return to corporate work, but the Sullivan Innovations disaster followed him. Companies would interview him with initial interest, but after background checks revealed the bankruptcy and the circumstances around his startup's funding, offers would mysteriously vanish. He'd been talented enough to succeed at his level, but his judgment was now suspect. The mid-level executive who'd once dreamed of disrupting industries found himself accepting a position at a regional consulting firm, making 1/3 of his Meridian salary. Victoria's settlement from the divorce was $5 million, as James had promised, but it was structured to pay out over 10 years. The arrangement prevented her from making another large, foolish investment, but it also meant she had to adjust to a lifestyle dramatically reduced from what she'd known. The Beacon Hill townhouse was sold, but James had bought it himself through a subsidiary and turned it into a foundation headquarters for educational initiatives. Victoria had driven past it once and seen children from underprivileged backgrounds attending computer programming workshops, but the irony had been too painful to contemplate. The relationship between Victoria and Derek deteriorated exactly as James had predicted, but with variations that made the dissolution even more bitter. They'd tried to maintain their connection, but every financial stress and professional setback had become a referendum on their choices. Derek had blamed Victoria for pushing him to leave a stable career, but Victoria had blamed Derek for not being capable of building something meaningful with the resources she'd provided. Both accusations had been partially true, but that only made them more effective weapons. They'd separated after 8 months, but the breakup had been acrimonious. Derek had wanted Victoria to share some of her settlement to help him rebuild, but Victoria had refused on advice from her attorney. She'd needed that money for her own survival, but more than that, some part of her had wanted Derek to suffer for failing her. The generosity she'd shown when stealing James's money had evaporated when it came to sharing the modest remains of her own fortune. James had watched all of this from a distance, but he'd taken no pleasure in their suffering. The revenge had been in the revelation rather than the aftermath. But once they understood what they'd destroyed, his interest had faded. He'd restructured Hammond Industries to be even more decentralized, but he'd also started making more public appearances in philanthropic contexts, if he was going to have his privacy invaded anyway. But he'd decided it should be for causes that mattered rather than tabloid speculation about his failed marriage. The AI platform that Meridian developed had indeed revolutionized small business technology, but its success had been exactly as predicted. The company made billions in the first year alone, but the profits had funded James's expanding charitable foundation rather than personal consumption. He'd realized during the divorce that accumulating wealth beyond a certain point was meaningless, but using it to create opportunity for others gave his work actual purpose. 3 years after sending the divorce text, Victoria had encountered James at a charity gala, but the meeting had been awkward for both of them. She'd been attending with a date, a perfectly nice attorney who made a solid income, but who represented safety rather than passion. James had been alone, but he'd seemed comfortable with solitude in ways he hadn't been during their marriage. They'd exchanged brief pleasantries, but both had recognized that they'd become strangers who'd once shared space. "I think about it sometimes," Victoria had said, but the admission had been quiet. "What I gave up. What I didn't understand." "I think about it too," James had replied, but his tone had been neutral. "I wonder if I should have told you the truth about my companies from the beginning, but I don't think it would have changed anything. You weren't interested in understanding my work. You were interested in the lifestyle it provided." "That's not entirely fair," Victoria had protested, but without much conviction. "I did love you once." "Maybe," James had acknowledged, but he'd said it gently. "Or maybe you loved what I could provide. I'll never know for certain, and at this point, it doesn't matter." We both moved on. The conversation had ended there, but both had walked away with a sense of closure that had been absent from their divorce. Victoria had realized that she'd spent 3 years being angry at James for revealing the truth, but she'd never actually been angry at herself for creating the situation. That self-awareness had come too late to change anything, but it had at least allowed her to stop blaming everyone else for her choices. Derek had fared worse in the years that followed, but his decline had been more gradual. The consulting job had been sustainable but unfulfilling, but he'd never recovered the confidence he'd possessed before Sullivan Innovations. He'd dated occasionally, but he'd been unable to form serious relationships because potential partners would eventually ask about his past. Explaining the failed startup meant revealing the circumstances of its funding, but that revelation inevitably led to judgment. He'd become a cautionary tale, but not the sympathetic kind. 5 years after the conference room revelation, Derek had received an unexpected email from James Hammond, but the message had been brief and professional. Meridian Tech Solutions was expanding its consulting division, but they had an opening for someone with Derek's specific expertise. The position paid well and offered room for advancement, but it required relocating to a city Derek had never considered living in. The offer was genuine, but it also came with a clear implication. James was willing to give Derek a path forward, but only if Derek was willing to completely start over. Derek had wrestled with the decision for weeks, but ultimately he'd accepted. The alternative was remaining stuck in a career trajectory that led nowhere, but more than that, he'd recognized the offer for what it was. Not forgiveness exactly, but an acknowledgement that his punishment had been sufficient. James wasn't being merciful out of kindness, but out of a sense that the lesson had been thoroughly learned. On Derek's first day at Meridian's consulting division, he'd received a package from James's office, but it had contained only a handwritten note. "You were good at what you did before you reached beyond your grasp. Focus on being excellent at the possible rather than chasing the improbable. The former builds careers, the latter destroys them. The advice had been characteristically direct, but Derek had recognized its value. He'd spent 5 years learning exactly how far beyond his grasp he'd reached, but now he had a chance to rebuild within appropriate boundaries. It wasn't the story he'd imagined for himself, but it was better than remaining trapped in the wreckage of his own ambition. Victoria's trajectory had been different, but parallel, but her reconciliation with reality had taken different forms. She'd eventually written a memoir about her experience, but the book had been unflinchingly honest about her mistakes. She'd called it The Price of Certainty, but the title referred to her absolute confidence that she'd understood her situation when she'd actually been blind to every relevant fact. The book had sold moderately well, but more importantly, it had given her a sense of purpose. She'd begun speaking to women's groups about the dangers of making major life decisions based on incomplete information. But her talks had resonated because she spoke from genuine experience rather than theoretical knowledge. She'd never remarried, but she'd built a life that had its own integrity. The attorney she'd been dating at the gala had eventually become a long-term partner, but their relationship was built on transparency and mutual respect rather than passion and secrets. It wasn't the life she'd imagined when she'd sent that divorce text, but it was sustainable in ways her marriage to James had never been. James himself had changed in subtle ways that few people noticed, but those close to him recognized the evolution. He'd become more willing to share information about Hammond Industries' structure with employees and partners, but he'd maintained enough privacy to preserve operational flexibility. He'd started dating, occasionally, but he'd been more careful about ensuring potential partners understood his actual situation from the beginning. The deception that had characterized his marriage to Victoria, even if it had been deception by omission, wasn't something he wanted to repeat. A decade after Victoria's divorce text, James had given a rare interview to a business publication, but the journalist had eventually asked about his marriage and its spectacular dissolution. James had considered the question carefully, but his answer had been characteristically thoughtful. "I spent 12 years of my life with someone who never really knew me," he'd said, but his tone had been reflective rather than bitter. "And I allowed that to happen because some part of me wanted to be loved for something other than my wealth and power. But the reality is that those things are part of who I am. Pretending they don't exist doesn't make you more authentic, it just makes you invisible." Victoria didn't fall in love with a consultant. She fell in love with a comfortable lifestyle. And when someone offered her what seemed like a better lifestyle, she moved toward it. That's not evil, it's just human, but it's also not the basis for a marriage. The interviewer had pressed for more details about the $350 million and the revenge James had orchestrated, but James had declined to elaborate. "That chapter is closed," he'd said firmly, but without hostility. "Everyone involved learned what they needed to learn, and we've all moved on. Dwelling on it serves no purpose." But privately, in moments of honest reflection, James knew the truth was more complicated. The revenge had been satisfying in the moment, but it hadn't healed the hurt of being discarded so casually. Watching Victoria and Derek's dreams collapse had proven that he was more powerful than they'd imagined, but it hadn't proven that Victoria had been wrong to leave. Maybe she had been unhappy. Maybe he had been too focused on his work. Maybe their marriage had been doomed, regardless of whether she'd discovered his true wealth. These were uncomfortable questions, but James had learned to sit with discomfort rather than engineering solutions to avoid it. Power could solve many problems, but it couldn't answer the fundamental question of whether he'd been a good husband or just a wealthy one. Victoria had never given him the chance to find out, but perhaps he'd never given her enough of himself to make that judgment fairly. The real lesson wasn't about revenge or consequences or the dangers of underestimating quiet people. But James had come to realize this only with time. The real lesson was that transparency matters, that relationships built on partial truths are fragile, and that power without connection is just an elaborate form of loneliness. He'd won the battle against Victoria and Derek, but he'd lost something more important in the process: the belief that he could maintain separation between his true self and the version he presented to the people closest to him. Victoria had learned different lessons, but they'd been equally hard-won. She'd learned that certainty is dangerous, that charm isn't the same as capability, and that burning bridges leaves you isolated when you need support. She'd learned that stealing, even when you convince yourself it's justified, has consequences that extend far beyond legal liability. Most importantly, she'd learned that the grass isn't greener on the other side, but it's just grass, and it requires the same care and attention regardless of whose lawn it grows on. Derek's lessons had been perhaps the harshest because they'd been about his own limitations, but facing those limitations had ultimately made him more effective within his actual capabilities. He'd learned that vision without execution is just fantasy, that other people's money isn't a substitute for genuine expertise, and that mid-level success is nothing to be ashamed of. The world needed competent professionals far more than it needed failed visionaries, but accepting that truth required surrendering ego. The story could have ended with dramatic courthouse confrontations or public recriminations, but real life rarely provides such clear resolutions. Instead, the three people whose lives had intersected so catastrophically simply continued living, but each carried forward the lessons of their collision. They saw each other occasionally in the overlapping circles of Boston's business and social scenes, but these encounters became less charged with each passing year. James continued building his empire, but with more attention to the human elements he'd once neglected. Victoria built a modest career as a speaker and writer, but she never again made the mistake of thinking she understood more than she did. Derek became an excellent consultant, but he learned to find satisfaction in excellence rather than constantly reaching for transformation. And somewhere in all of that, buried beneath the revenge and the consequences and the spectacular collapse of dreams, was a simpler truth. People are complicated, relationships are fragile, and sometimes the only way to learn what matters is to lose everything you thought you wanted. The Trillionaire dollar company, the $350 million, the text message divorce, all of it was just context for three people discovering uncomfortable truths about themselves and each other. The shock had faded, but the lessons remained. But that was precisely the point of the entire painful exercise. Some revelations can only come through destruction, but some lessons can only be learned by experiencing consequences fully. James had engineered those consequences with precision, but in doing so he'd revealed truths about himself that he'd spent years avoiding. Victoria had sought freedom and passion, but she'd found accountability and limitation. Derek had reached for greatness, but he'd found his actual level. None of them got what they wanted, but all of them learned what they needed to know. And in the final analysis, that was worth more than $350 million, but only because they'd paid that price to learn it. 15 years after the divorce text, James Hammond stood in front of a congressional committee, but his testimony wasn't about business practices or antitrust concerns. The hearing focused on corporate transparency and the responsibilities of anonymous wealth, but James had volunteered to speak rather than being subpoenaed. At 71, his hair had gone completely silver, but his presence remained quietly commanding in ways that no longer surprised anyone who knew his actual position in the global economy. "The question before us," James had said during his opening statement, but his voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom, "isn't whether wealthy individuals have the right to privacy. The question is whether privacy becomes deception when it affects people who deserve to know the truth." He'd been thinking about Victoria when he'd written those words, but he'd been thinking about himself more. The committee had listened with genuine interest because James Hammond had become something unusual in American business, a trillionaire who admitted mistakes and examined his own motivations publicly. His transformation hadn't been sudden, but it had been real. Victoria had watched the hearing from her apartment in Portland, but she'd moved across the country 7 years ago to escape the persistent shadow of her past in Boston. She was 63 now, but she'd aged into herself in ways that her younger self would have found incomprehensible. The attorney she'd been dating had eventually become her husband in a quiet courthouse ceremony, but their marriage was built on such different foundations than her first that comparing them felt absurd. Her hand rested on a book manuscript sitting beside her laptop. But this wasn't another memoir. She'd spent 3 years writing a novel about a woman who discovers too late that she'd married someone extraordinary, but had been too self-absorbed to notice. The book was fiction in its details, but its emotional truth was undeniable. Her agent thought it could be her breakthrough work, but Victoria had made peace with the possibility that it might sell modestly and disappear. She'd learned to measure success differently. On the television, James was answering a senator's question about whether corporations should be required to disclose their full ownership structures, but his answer was nuanced in ways that surprised her. Transparency is important, he'd said, but he'd paused before continuing. But so is the right to build something without becoming a public spectacle. The problem isn't privacy itself, it's when privacy enables harm. In my own marriage, I used privacy as a shield, without considering how it might make my wife feel like she was married to a stranger. That wasn't fair, but neither was it illegal. We can't legislate away human complexity. Victoria had felt tears forming, but they weren't from sadness. James was talking about their marriage on national television, but he was doing it with a fairness that acknowledged both their failures. She'd spent years being angry at him for the revenge, but somewhere along the way, she'd realized that his response had been proportional to her cruelty. The 43-word text message had deserved consequences, but those consequences had also given her the opportunity to rebuild herself into someone better. Her phone buzzed with a message from Derek, but their communication had become surprisingly functional over the years. Watching the hearing, his text read, "But there was more. He's being more generous about his mistakes than he needs to be. Makes me think about how I've told our story over the years. Maybe too much emphasis on being a victim." Victoria had smiled at that, but she'd typed a response carefully. "We were all victims of our own blindness, but we were also all responsible for our choices. Both things can be true." Derek was in Singapore now, but his relocation to Meridian's consulting division had eventually led to international assignments that suited his talents. He'd risen to senior partner over the past decade, but his success had been earned through consistent execution rather than dramatic vision. He'd married 5 years ago a Singaporean architect who knew his history but judged him on who he'd become rather than who he'd been. They had a daughter who was 3, but fatherhood had changed Derek in ways he hadn't anticipated. He'd been thinking lately about what he would tell his daughter about this period of his life, but he hadn't found adequate words yet. How do you explain to a child that her father had once been complicit in stealing hundreds of millions of dollars because he'd been seduced by a combination of love and ambition? The story had no easy moral, but that was perhaps the point. Life's most important lessons rarely fit into simple frameworks. Back in Washington, James had fielded several more questions, but the hearing had been winding down when a young congresswoman had asked something that cut deeper than the policy discussions. "Mr. Hammond, you've spoken about the balance between privacy and transparency in business, but what about in personal relationships? If you could go back, would you have told your ex-wife the truth about your companies from the beginning?" The question had hung in the air, but James had taken his time answering. "I've thought about that constantly for 15 years, he'd finally said, but his voice had carried genuine emotion. "And the honest answer is that I don't know. If I'd told Victoria the full truth, would she have married me for myself or for my wealth? I'll never know, but by hiding the truth, I guaranteed she never really knew me at all. So perhaps the better question is, why did I want to be with someone who I didn't trust with the truth? That's the question I should have asked myself before the marriage, but I only understood it after. Victoria had pressed her hand to her mouth, but she'd been watching James's face on the screen. He'd looked directly at the camera when answering, but she'd wondered if he'd known she might be watching. Probably not, but the sentiment was genuine regardless. He'd been interrogating his own choices in ways that gave her permission to stop interrogating hers. Her husband had entered the room carrying 2 cups of tea, but he'd seen her expression and understood immediately. The hearing, he'd asked, but his tone had been gentle rather than jealous. He knew about her past because she'd told him everything before they'd married, but he'd never made her feel defined by those mistakes. James is testifying about corporate transparency, Victoria had explained, but she'd accepted the tea gratefully. But he's also talking about us, about the marriage, about how we both contributed to its failure. That's generous of him, her husband had observed, but he'd sat beside her. Most people prefer clean narratives where they're innocent and others are guilty. We've all gotten older, Victoria had said, but she'd meant it as a compliment to everyone involved, and hopefully wiser. I spent years thinking James's revenge was cruel, but he gave me something valuable, even if he delivered it harshly. He forced me to see myself clearly. That's a gift, even when it's painful. The hearing had concluded shortly after, but James had been surrounded by reporters asking for additional comments. He'd declined most requests, but one journalist had asked specifically about whether he'd reconciled with his ex-wife. James's answer had been brief, but significant. Victoria and I haven't spoken in years, but I hope she's well. We were wrong for each other, but that doesn't mean I wish her harm. Sometimes people need to go their separate ways, but that doesn't require ongoing animosity. I learned what I needed to learn, and I suspect she did too. 3 weeks after the hearing, Victoria had done something she'd been considering for months, but the testimony had given her the final push she needed. She'd written James a letter, not an email or text, but an actual handwritten letter on quality stationery. The letter had taken her 3 drafts to get right, but the final version had been honest without being maudlin. James, it had begun, but she'd chosen her words carefully. I watched your congressional testimony, and I was struck by your willingness to examine your own mistakes publicly. It made me realize that I've never properly apologized for how I ended our marriage, not just for leaving, but for the cruelty of how I did it. A text message after 12 years was cowardly, but more than that, it was deliberately hurtful. I wanted you to feel small because some part of me had always felt small in the marriage, but that wasn't your fault. It was mine for never asking the right questions or trying to understand what you were actually building. You were right about everything that happened afterward. Derek and I weren't building love. We were building a shared delusion. The $350 million didn't make him capable of succeeding. It just made our failure more expensive. And your revenge, while painful, forced me to see truths I'd been avoiding. I've built a better life because you refused to let me avoid consequences. I'm not asking for forgiveness because I don't think you owe me that. But I wanted you to know that I understand now what I destroyed. Not just the money or the marriage, but the possibility of actually knowing someone extraordinary. If I'd been willing to look past my own assumptions, that loss is mine to carry. But carrying it has made me more careful with the relationships I have now. I hope you found peace, James, but more than that, I hope you found someone who sees you clearly and loves what they see. You deserved that then, but I wasn't capable of providing it. Victoria. She'd mailed the letter without overthinking it, but she hadn't expected a response. The letter had been for her own peace of mind rather than to reopen communication. But 6 weeks later, a package had arrived at her Portland address, but it had contained a book and a short note. The book was a recently published biography of industrial pioneers, but it included a chapter on James and the deliberate anonymity he'd maintained throughout his career. The note had been vintage James, brief and thoughtful. "Victoria, I appreciated your letter more than you probably realize. Apologies matter, even 15 years late. But what mattered more was seeing that you've examined your own motivations honestly. That takes courage. I found the chapter about me in this book illuminating because it's written by someone who researched my work without knowing me personally. She concluded that my anonymity was less about humility and more about control, wanting influence without accountability. She's probably right, but I didn't see it until someone outside the situation pointed it out. Maybe we all need external perspectives to see ourselves clearly. I have found peace, but thank you for wishing it. But I haven't found what you suggested. Perhaps I'm not meant to. Or perhaps I'm still learning how to be known, which turns out to be harder than building trillion-dollar empires. Either way, I'm grateful that you're well and that we can both look at our shared past without needing to revise it into something it wasn't." James Derrick had received his own communication from James around the same time, but it had come through official Meridian channels. James had announced his retirement from day-to-day operations, but as part of the transition, he'd restructured the executive team. Derrick had been promoted to global managing partner for Meridian's consulting division, but the promotion had come with a personal note from James that Derrick had read 3 times before fully absorbing. "Derrick, you've spent 15 years proving that competence and consistency create value. This promotion isn't charity or absolution. It's recognition that you've become exactly the kind of leader Meridian needs. But you did it by focusing on excellence within your scope, rather than reaching beyond your grasp. That lesson cost you and me $350 million, but you actually learned it, which makes you more valuable than people who never face their limitations. I'm not asking you to thank me for the lesson or the opportunity. I'm simply acknowledging that you've earned this position through performance. What happened 15 years ago is context, but it's not your definition unless you let it be. Don't let it be." James, Derrick had called his wife into his home office and read her the note, but his voice had caught several times. "He's giving me permission to stop defining myself by my worst mistake," Derrick had said, but tears had been streaming down his face. I didn't realize how much I needed that permission. His wife had held him while he'd cried, but she'd understood that the tears were about release rather than sadness. Derrick had carried the weight of Sullivan Innovations' failure for 15 years, but James's note had somehow given him permission to set it down. The promotion was significant, but the acknowledgement that he'd learned and grown mattered more. 5 years after the congressional hearing, James had established a new foundation focused on financial literacy and entrepreneurship education, but its mission statement had been unusually personal for a corporate entity. This foundation exists to help people understand the difference between vision and capability, between access and ownership, between confidence and competence. These distinctions matter, but they're rarely taught explicitly. We aim to teach them before people learn through expensive failure. Victoria had been invited to join the Foundation's advisory board, but the invitation had come through a third party rather than directly from James. She'd accepted after consulting with her husband, but her decision had been based on believing in the mission rather than seeking reconnection with her ex-husband. The Foundation's work was important, but more than that, her experience gave her credibility in discussing the consequences of financial overconfidence. The first advisory board meeting had been carefully structured to minimize awkwardness, but James and Victoria had eventually found themselves in the same conversation cluster during a break. 20 years had passed since the divorce text, but both had changed enough that the interaction had been more curious than painful. "Your novel was excellent," James had said, but it had been his opening observation. "I read it last year. The protagonist's journey felt authentic in ways that fiction rarely manages." Victoria had been surprised he'd read it, but also pleased. "Thank you. It helped me process things I couldn't address directly, but fiction gave me permission to explore emotional truths without relitigating facts." "I understood that," James had replied, but his tone had been warm. "The husband character was more sympathetic than I probably deserved, but I appreciated the complexity. You didn't make him a villain or a saint, just a flawed person who made understandable mistakes." "We all made understandable mistakes," Victoria had said, but she'd meant it as absolution for everyone involved. The question was whether we'd learn from them. I think we all did, but we learned slowly and painfully. "The only way anyone really learns," James had agreed, but he'd smiled. "Though I'm trying to make it easier for the next generation through this foundation. Maybe they can learn from our mistakes instead of making their own quite so expensively." They'd talked for 20 minutes about the foundation's work, but the conversation had been comfortable in ways that would have seemed impossible 2 decades earlier. They weren't friends exactly, but they weren't enemies either. They were two people who'd shared a disaster and survived it to become better versions of themselves, but that created its own kind of bond. Derek had visited the foundation a year later as a guest speaker, but his presentation on the realities of entrepreneurship had been brutally honest about his own failure. He'd shown actual financial documents from Sullivan Innovations' collapse, but he'd walked the audience through each decision that had contributed to the disaster. The students had been riveted because Derek hadn't sugarcoated anything, but he'd also shown how he'd rebuilt from that failure. After the presentation, Derek had encountered both James and Victoria in the foundation's lobby, but it had been the first time all three had been in the same space since the conference room revelation. The moment could have been awkward, but instead it had felt strangely complete, like a circle closing after years of remaining open. "We should probably talk about this at some point," Derek had said, but he'd gestured at the three of them. "About what happened and what we've all become since. Not for closure, I think we've all found that individually, but maybe for perspective." "A conversation, not a confrontation," Victoria had clarified, but she'd looked at James. "Would that interest you, or would it feel like reopening old wounds?" James had considered the question carefully, but his answer had been thoughtful. "I think it might be valuable, but only if we can approach it without needing to assign blame or extract apologies. We all know what happened. The question is whether discussing it adds understanding or just scratches old scars." They'd agreed to meet for dinner the following month, but the meeting had taken place at a neutral restaurant chosen by mutual agreement. The dinner had lasted 4 hours, but the conversation had ranged far beyond their shared history. They'd talked about what they'd each learned about themselves, about relationships, about money and power and the ways people deceive themselves, but they'd done it with the emotional distance that only time can provide. "I think I was in love with the idea of being essential," Victoria had said at one point, but she'd been examining her younger self with anthropological curiosity. "Derek made me feel like I was the key to his success, but James, you never made me feel necessary. You were so self-sufficient that I felt like decoration rather than partner." "That's fair criticism," James had acknowledged, but he'd accepted it without defensiveness. "I didn't know how to need people without it feeling like weakness, so I built a life where I didn't need anyone, but then I was surprised when my wife felt peripheral to it. That was short-sighted. And I mistook your generosity for stupidity," Derek had added, but he'd directed this at Victoria rather than James. "When you were funding Sullivan Innovations, I convinced myself you were this bold visionary seeing opportunities your husband missed, but you were just spending money that someone else had earned, but neither of us understood that distinction at the time." The honesty had been uncomfortable but productive. But by the end of the dinner, all three had felt something shift. They weren't erasing the past or pretending it hadn't been painful, but they were contextualizing it in ways that reduced its power over their present lives. The affair, the theft, the revenge, all of it had happened, but it had happened to younger, more foolish versions of themselves. "I don't regret how it ended," James had said near the conclusion of the evening, but he'd been looking at Victoria. "I regret that it had to end that way, but the ending itself was probably inevitable. We were incompatible in fundamental ways, but neither of us could see it, because we weren't honest with ourselves or each other. The dramatic collapse just accelerated what should have been a gradual recognition. I spent years being angry at you for the revenge," Victoria had admitted, but she'd said it without heat. "But I eventually realized you were teaching me something I couldn't have learned any other way. I thought I understood money and business and relationships, but I understood none of it. The $350 million was tuition for an education I desperately needed." Expensive tuition, Derek had noted, but he'd said it with a wry smile. "Though I suppose I was enrolled in the same course, different lessons, but same school of hard knocks." They'd parted that evening with a sense of completion that none had expected, but the dinner had given each of them permission to fully release the past. The story had been dramatic and painful, but it had also been educational in ways that only experience can provide. Some lessons require destruction to be learned, but that doesn't make them less valuable, just more expensive. 25 years after the divorce text, James Hammond died peacefully in his sleep at 81. But his death made international news because his full wealth had finally been calculated. The trillionaire dollar empire had grown into something even larger, but his will had been structured to prevent dynastic concentration of wealth. The vast majority of his fortune had been distributed to foundations and educational initiatives, but two specific bequests had surprised everyone who knew the history. Victoria had received a letter from James's estate attorney, but it had contained a check for $50 million and a note James had written shortly before his death. "Victoria, this represents the settlement you should have received if I'd been generous rather than punitive 25 years ago. I've watched you build a meaningful life with modest resources, but you did it with integrity I hadn't anticipated. This money won't change your character now, but it might give you freedom to expand the work you're doing. Use it wisely, but don't be afraid to enjoy some of it. You've earned the right to both. James." Derek had received a similar letter, but his had contained a different kind of gift. James had transferred ownership of Meridian's consulting division directly to Derek, but the transfer had been structured to benefit all the division's partners rather than enriching Derek personally. The note had explained, "Derek, you spent 15 years proving you could build something sustainable when given proper structure and support. This division is now yours to lead, without answering to parent company oversight, but I'm structuring it to benefit everyone who contributed to its success. That seems more fitting than individual enrichment. Build something lasting. James." At James's memorial service, both Victoria and Derek had attended, but they'd sat separately because they'd come with their own families. The service had been surprisingly intimate for someone of James's wealth and influence, but he'd specified in his will that he wanted a small gathering focused on personal connections rather than business achievements. Victoria had been asked to speak, but her remarks had been brief and honest. "James Hammond taught me the most valuable and painful lesson of my life," she'd said, but her voice had been steady. "He taught me that actions have consequences, that ignorance isn't innocence, and that the truth matters even when it's uncomfortable. He didn't teach me gently, but he taught me effectively. But more importantly, he lived long enough to forgive me for needing to be taught. That forgiveness was a greater gift than the money he left me, but I'm grateful for both. He was a better person than I understood when I was married to him. but I'm glad I lived long enough to recognize that and tell him so. Derek's remarks had focused on redemption and second chances, but he'd been honest about his own failures. James Hammond had every reason to destroy my career permanently 25 years ago, Derek had said, but his voice had carried emotion. Instead, he gave me a path forward that required me to prove myself through sustained effort. That was harder than if he'd just forgiven me, but it was also more valuable. He believed I could become someone worth respecting if I was willing to do the work. He was right, but I only succeeded because he created space for that growth. I'll spend the rest of my life honoring that gift by helping others find their own paths forward. After the service, Victoria and Derek had found themselves standing together near James's grave, but neither had spoken immediately. Finally, Victoria had broken the silence with an observation that summarized everything. We were all so young and so certain we understood the world. The fact that we lived long enough to realize how wrong we were feels like its own kind of grace. Expensive grace, Derek had replied, but he'd smiled at the echo of their earlier conversation. But grace nonetheless. James could have destroyed us completely, but he chose to destroy our delusions instead. That distinction matters. They'd stood together for a few more minutes, but then had returned to their separate lives. The connection between them would always exist because of their shared history, but it wasn't a connection that required maintenance or ongoing contact. Some relationships exist in a specific time and place, but their influence extends far beyond their active duration. Victoria had lived another 12 years after James's death, but she'd used his bequest to establish scholarships for women rebuilding their lives after major mistakes. The program was called Second Chapter Scholarships, but its mission statement had been drawn from her own experience. For women who've learned that certainty is dangerous and that rebuilding requires honesty. She'd funded hundreds of women through education and training programs, but each recipient had been required to write an essay about a major mistake they'd made and what they'd learned from it. Derek had run Meridian's consulting division for another 15 years, but he'd eventually retired to focus on mentorship and teaching. He'd written a book called Competence Over Vision, Why Sustainable Success Beats Spectacular Failure, but the book had become required reading in several business schools. His daughter, now grown, had followed him into consulting, but she'd done it with clear eyes about both the possibilities and limitations of the field. The story of the divorce text, the $350 million, and the spectacular revenge had become something of a legend in business circles, but over time it had evolved from scandal into teaching parable. Business school professors used it to discuss ethics, judgment, relationship dynamics, and the proper scope of both ambition and retaliation. Some saw James as the hero, but others saw him as excessively cruel. Some saw Victoria as a villain, but others saw her as a woman who'd tried to escape an emotionally distant marriage and made catastrophic tactical errors. The truth, as always, was more complicated than any simple narrative could capture, but that's what made the story valuable. It wasn't a fairy tale with clear moral lessons, but rather a messy human drama where everyone made understandable mistakes with devastating consequences, but where everyone also grew from those consequences into better versions of themselves. That journey from certainty to destruction to understanding to growth was the real story, but it was a story that could only be understood with time and distance. In the end, the $350 million was just money, but the relationships it destroyed and eventually helped rebuild were irreplaceable. The trillionaire dollar empire was just business, but the human connections it both prevented and ultimately enabled were what mattered. And the divorce text, those 43 words that had started everything, was just communication, but the conversation it eventually sparked about honesty, consequences, and redemption echoed long after all the participants were gone. Some stories end with resolution, but this one ended with understanding. And perhaps In the final analysis, that was always the point. Not to win or lose, but to finally completely understand what had been at stake all along. The shock had faded decades ago, but the lessons remained, passed forward to new generations who would make their own mistakes, but hopefully learn from the expensive education that James, Victoria, and Derek had purchased with their shared disaster. The weight of understanding, it turned out, was lighter than the weight of ignorance, but it took a lifetime to learn how to carry it properly.